How do you win the race against risk and safely lock down your cloud data without hiring an army of administrators? Introducing Least Privilege Automation, only from Varonis. Varonis eliminates data exposures while your employees work and while they sleep, making intelligent decisions about who needs access to data and who doesn't. Our cloud-native solution analyzes permissions and sharing links, monitors access activity, and classifies sensitive data. Because Varonis knows who can and who does access critical data, our automation safely remediates risky links and permissions. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Varonis.
Created in 2005 and hosted by security industry veterans, Paul Security Weekly is your source for in-depth coverage of the latest vulnerabilities, exploits, and security research. Our weekly security news discussion dives deep into the security issues we face today and potential solutions in a fun and lively atmosphere. Each week, we bring on guests from the security community to learn about their journey and discuss topics relevant to their work and research. You can also subscribe to our show by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe or look for Paul Security Weekly in your favorite podcast catcher. We've recorded a ton of content over the years, so we created Spotify playlists featuring some of our favorite episodes, including interviews with Marcus Random, John McAfee, and Chris Roberts, to name a few. You can find them at securityweekly.com/starter packs.
Welcome back to Business Security Weekly. I am your host, Matt Alderman, joined by Jason Albuquerque, Ben Carr, and Tyler Robinson. You can now find us on Instagram. You won't find me on Instagram, but you can follow us for highlight reels, giveaway announcements, and more at Sec Weekly. All right, so let's jump into the second segment of the CISO role. So, Jason, you said you have a long list of requirements for this role. Now, in the previous segment, I think where we kind of landed was there should be some executive level position that has some responsibilities around security, probably risk management and privacy. And again, to Ben's point, this is going to vary organization to organization. So I get that. But let's start to dig in. Like, if you're an executive, like, what are the responsibilities you are now responsible for in this role?
Yeah. And just, I want to couple it with just one comment, because I feel like we're at a tipping point right now. And it's because of what we talked about in the previous segment was levels of accountability that are expected of CISOs, but the ability to influence isn't there. And this is a staggering stat that came out of, I think it's the Voice of the CISO report that Proofpoint did, and it just came out in May. And 61% of CISOs feel like their job expectations are unreasonable, compared to 49% in 2022. A third of security leaders are considering quitting their jobs. Think about that for a hot minute. The pressures, the challenges, all of this that's happening is starting to have an adverse effect on these cybersecurity leaders. And what's that going to do for the workforce that's going to be available for these professional security leaders? That's scary stats.
Right, but then couple that with the Joe Sullivan case on the Uber side and the recent Wells notice to SolarWinds CISO, right? I mean, that just puts additional stress on top of being overwhelmed already, doesn't it?
Yep, it absolutely does.
But I think the intersection of those things.
Go ahead, Ben.
Go ahead, Jason.
No, I was just going to say we're gonna come to a point, and that's why I called it a tipping point. We're going to have very qualified professionals who could fill these roles deciding to walk away. And then what does that do? We just talked about how important it is to have an executive at the table with these responsibilities that we're going to talk about. We're not going to be able to get good people in those roles.
Yeah, I was going to tie that in and say, I think the issue why you see people walking away or the high percentages of people who say they're not able to do their job is because it's the intersection of the responsibility and the lack of authority, right? This issue where, and that's, I think, maybe where people generally talk about a seat at the table is two things. One, I've often said that in order to be able to protect something, you need to know what you're protecting, right? And so if you don't have insight into the strategy that the company's making, if you're not at the table understanding the decisions and more importantly, why they're being made, then it becomes super hard to create a defensive posture around that and understand how to balance the risk in the correct way, right? And then you couple that with the fact that you've got all the responsibility of people saying, well, you're the security guy, fix it. But you've got none of the authority to get anything done or create forcing functions, right? Or have those discussions, that one-on-one time with the CEO to say, hey, this is where I'm experiencing, pushback or having a difficulty. And, we need to move the company a different direction, and have those same aligned talks that other executives are having. Then it becomes it's an untenable position, right? You just can't succeed at it. And so that's when people start to walk away or switch companies. They feel like they can't be successful.
Right. But then you see the personal risk that's at hand now. I mean, the SolarWinds Wells notice is a huge piece of that, right? And just for the listeners, so they know, a Wells notice is from the SEC, and it issues a notice to a firm when it's planning on bringing enforcement against the firm for an SEC violation. And basically what they're saying is that in the letter is that the SolarWinds CFO and CISO were violating securities laws in response to the SolarWinds breach, the supply chain attack. So, I mean, think about that. That the end game there is that they could face civil, monetary penalties, and they could be barred from ever being an executive of another public company ever again.
Yeah, that's the big one, right? That has long-term career implications for anybody that gets issued a Wells notice. It becomes really, really hard to get a job. So you're now personally, not only like, did you have a bad experience at a company and maybe potentially your name's associated with it, but now your monetary income for the rest of your life is affected by that in a negative way. I mean, now ask who wants the job.
That's right. And that it's all of these pressures, right? That you make you sit back and say, why? When you have the level of accountability of a CISO, but your ability to influence the organization, you don't have the seat at the table to make the influence, to make the changes that you need, right? So it's a no-win situation if you don't have a seat at the table. And I think that's why it's important that we talk about this. If you don't have a seat at the table, that's high personal risk.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is the CFO knows they have high personal risk in that role as a public company because Sarbanes-Oxley is in play, right? Like, it's known.
They're signing on the dotted line the day they take that job.
Exactly right.
And they're negotiating.
CEO,
they're negotiating in that they know that they're a named officer of the company. They know that they're covered, right, as an officer of the company.
Right.
And hopefully they're negotiating liability. They're negotiating an exit strategy if things go wrong. They're negotiating a lot. And so I can't tell you how many CISOs, when they're going in for these roles, you're not negotiating an exit package. You're not negotiating, potential benefits, right, upon exit. You're not negotiating that your non-competes go away. You're not like all these things, and more importantly, you're not negotiating that you are a named officer of the company and as a result are protected, right?
That's right.
And if you don't have that stuff, there's a lot of risk.
Mm-hmm.
That's what makes it so unprecedented, right? To have a CISO named in this order. Again, the Joe Sullivan case was a precedent that was did not help the role. This one just takes it to the next level because you now name the CISO in this notice that has potentially huge personal impact without having any opportunity to negotiate like the CFO or the CEO would. Yeah.
And in its current state, there's no SEC regulation to put the CISO to give the CISO a seat at the table, to force that to happen.
Yeah, to give him air cover, right? I mean, essentially, yeah.
So look what just happened. That's awful, right? There's no mandate of having a cybersecurity executive with a seat at the table, but there's oversight enough that they can sit back and send this Wells notice to a CISO.
Yeah.
No bueno.
Right. So, Jason, you're a CISO, right? You sit in the chair. You're not. I don't think you're part of a public company, though, so you probably don't have to worry about private. SEC Wells notice. But I mean, think about hypothetically, right? If you were to move, like, what are the criteria you look for now going forward in this environment? Because I think that's really important for people to understand, because this is going to influence how you hire a CISO and what CISOs need to do to evaluate whether they want that position or not.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think to Ben's earlier point, he's in the middle of it right now, but you walk in the door having the conversation of, number one, what am I accountable for, and what level of influence do I have, at the executive level? Those are the two first conversations you need to have before you even figure out if you want to take another step forward. Because if the organization comes and to what Ben said earlier, they're trying to put more tactical folks in play, I would step away from that right away. Because at the end of it, I know that if the stuff hits the fan, fingers are going to start pointing my way. And if I don't have that leverage to move the needle, it's a no-win situation for me.
Absolutely.
What are your thoughts, Ben? I mean, again, you're in the middle of this right now, so.
Yeah, look, I just think we're caught at the intersection right now of people who are coming in who aren't experienced, and so they're going to be willing to take those roles because they're seeing it as a promotion, right? But they're not coming in with the experience to know what to push back on and what to say, right? And even experienced CISOs who've been doing this, I think, it's hard when you're out there and you're looking for a job and somebody approaches you with something and you go and you say, hey, these are the things I need. Like if other people aren't standing firm on those same asks, it puts you in a weird spot if you're not comfortable. So I just think we all have to take a really hard look at what the industry looks like and what we're going to do. And I guess, again, I go back to, creating some type of standards, right? There are organizations for lawyers, there are organizations for financial officers. We're not really seeing that for security officers, CISOs, risk officers, whatever you want to call them. And I think maybe it's time to see something like that evolve where we can start pushing off some best practices that we can all leverage against. But I think that's super important to figure out how we do that.
Because really, it's really up to each individual to kind of figure this out on their own, right? I mean, and that's probably part of the challenge moving forward is what questions do I ask? What things should I require? What does a base employee contract look like for a CISO based on the responsibilities and in the accountability you're going to have, right? I mean, these are huge
and
questions.
I'd say this is new. Like 2 or 3 years ago, this wasn't common to have these conversations, and you were really behind the 8 ball if you brought this up and tried to have those conversations, right? Like I think this is all emerging and running very quickly, right? That people are going to have to understand that. There's a lot of people who aren't educated on it.
Yeah. And then to that point, now you have executives within the organization, like a CEO or CFO, who don't understand the nuances driving what the responsibilities are, because there is no best practice. So that allows for the unicorn CISO to exist, right? Because not every CISO has the same set of responsibilities or work roles as the other CISO. I mean, that's why we're talking about it right now. What should they be? Right? Because every organization is different.
Yeah, I go back to my Sarbanes-Oxley example, right? The AICPA is who put out the guidelines around financial reporting, right? That was the organization that kind of set the foundation for that. And it was based on principles around financial reporting. That type of structure doesn't exist for cybersecurity, right? Which is to Ben's point, right? It doesn't exist. And without it, like what is the baseline for what good security reporting and requirements should be?
Yeah. I think we just put a challenge out there to the entire industry.
Yeah, who's going to create that organization? But I mean, I think, look, it's something that I think is warranted because we also talked about it's not just security, right? There's a privacy component to this. There's a risk component to this. Like, how do these things come together in a more principled, risk management discipline? Maybe is the better way to think about it, because security is a risk management principle, or at least it should be, even though it may not be viewed that way. Maybe this is a broader risk management discussion than it is just a security discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I think it lends well. I mean, the majority of what we do is managing risk to the organization, right? It's a big piece of what the responsibilities are. The closest thing we have to that collection is, I mean, you guys have probably seen it. Every year or every other year, there's somebody on. There's a person on LinkedIn who comes out with their CISO mind map every year. You guys have probably seen that, and it's like that's the closest thing we have. No, we should have something structured, and we should have some level of governing body who can sit back and say, best practices are this. The responsibilities are these things.
Yeah, and I think that some of the challenge has been around that. Like if you think about some of the things we've talked about that are a little bit tangential, we've talked about privacy, right? So in my experience, privacy is a challenging one because there's a lot of that, same thing in security, but there's a lot of it that sits in legal, right? That's the regulation and the law around privacy. And that's not typically something CISOs are going to have a mandate over. And so it's almost a shared function in my experience, between legal and between security. Some companies are large enough where they have a dedicated privacy officer, and it sits kind of as the intersection of that. But it's still, it really relies heavily on security and heavily on legal. And then there's things like physical security, right, which sit outside of the typical things we deal with from a technical aspect. There are technical things about physical security, but generally it's security guards, right, in a very large organization. It's door security. It's, what's the access control thing like for your badge readers, which that's not something typically a CISO has a lot of experience in. Same thing for privacy. That's an emergent function as well. But then if you think about risk, I think a lot of CISOs foundationally grew up in this tech side of the house. And so when you talk about risk, that's an art in and of itself a little bit, right? Depending upon what methodology or how, where you go down a risk side, we deal with risk in a little bit different lens than risk to like risk of financial controls, right? Risk around, locational risk, right? How do we handle, personal protection in Costa Rica when somebody travels there? Like those are all things that are outside the scope. So how do you grow the knowledge base?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jason.
No, I was going to say there's a huge difference between the chief risk officer role and mandate and the CISO role and mandate, right? Because you're absolutely right. I mean, a CRO they're juggling market risk, credit risk, right? All the compliance risk, the legal risk, governance risks. They're looking at, protections to make sure, there's no insolvency. I mean, they're looking at risk at the highest levels of the organization. A CISO is one component. And, I almost feel like we need that RACI chart, the responsibility, accountability. Am I consulted or am I informed? Right? Because we're going to have one of those in each one of these sections. Right? Are we 100% accountable for these things? Do we have responsibilities in these other areas? Is this an area where I'm strictly consulted as a subject matter expert? Or do I just need to know what's going on? We need that.
And if you tie that back and pivot it and think about like the larger question of like, do they get a seat at the table? Who has the seat at the table, right? And I think about, we all gravitate back towards that person, if it has a seat at the table, should report into the CEO, right? Everybody agrees with that fact. If that's the case, like how many seats are there at the table and how do you divide them up? Because if I think about myself, how many directors do I want? You get to a sphere of control issue where, a wise man once told me, like, if you've got enough people at the table, too many people at the table that you can't feed with 2 pizzas, you've got too many people, right? And you need to start then breaking that up and rolling it down. And so you think about the CEO, if he's got 6 guys, 8 guys, 10 guys, 12 guys, like where does that become too many? And then you need a centralization to roll those individual responsibilities up under. And I think that's an interesting question, an interesting dilemma that I don't think we think about it a lot. We think about it from our perspective, but not the perspective of the CEO who has to interact and spread the love.
Yeah, right. I've seen that in action twice over the course of my career, where all of a sudden there was executive sprawl, and the CEO finally had the epiphany of saying, "I need to consolidate my management, otherwise I'm not going to be able to go be the proper CEO and do my job." And I've seen that happen twice over the course of my career, where they're just like, "Here's what we're doing. Here's going to be, the executive leadership team, and then you have executives."
Yeah, I know of a company. I can think of one company right off the top of my head that the CEO has I think it's like 50 or 60 people reporting to him. I'm not sure how that really scales.
Unmanageable.
that doesn't work, right? And then there is no seat at the table because nobody gets time, right? And so it's just it's kind of a mess.
The table's not big enough, Ben, and you can't get a big enough table.
Every executive only gets a pepperoni.
Yeah, exactly.
It better be a double
you're walking away going, I just got
pizza.
left with crust. I didn't get anything.
But that's why I asked the question in the first segment, which is it really the CISO that reports to the CEO, right? So think about the big chunks, right?
Mm-hmm.
Financial, operation, legal, right? You could say risk is a bucket, sales and revenue might be a bucket. Like that's five or so executives reporting to the CEO. I mean, once you start getting past like
chief
6,
people officer who manage the people, we haven't talked about
officer,
if you're a service
you got a product guy, chief technology,
who leads your services or products, right? So,
like it gets up there pretty quickly, right? You could probably call off, like everybody would probably agree that there's 6 or 7 that are they're on the list, right? Mm-hmm. Then there starts to become these second tier chief executives that are. Right. What are they, right? Which it's going to vary on company on the import that they apply to that role. But I definitely think somebody if in your top 3 risks, security is one, somebody's got to have ownership of that at the executive level that actually understands it and gets it.
And if there are legal and regulatory components that could adversely affect the business and the people, I think that's a top tier executive as well.
I take it further. If there are legal and regulatory components that can end your business.
End your business, yes. Got it. Duly noted, sir. Duly noted. Right.
And if you're going to have that level of role in the organization, then make sure you have the right protections like every other officer of the company.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you're opening yourself up to personal risk that I just don't think many would be comfortable with.
Again,
I don't think most people understand the level of personal risk that they're under. Yeah, there isn't motivation, but I think it's even further than that, Jason. It's the knowledge. It's the knowledge that you are under that potential level of risk. I'm swagging it, but I'd say probably 90% of CISOs don't understand the actual level of personal risk that they're taking on in that role, potentially.
Yeah, no. Mine was more along the lines of, the board of directors and the CEO. Right now, there isn't a stick to force them to say, right. I need a CISO at the executive level. And I fear that it's never going to happen until that stick gets thrown around there, and it's starting to.
Yeah,
right?
I'm not a fan of regulation either, but I almost feel like regulation will need to be applied to make that change, because otherwise, there isn't an incentive, there isn't a stick. I'd rather have a carrot, but I don't think that's coming.
Me too.
Yeah, but I think organizations are not also necessarily prepared for what that does to the role and what changes with the role. Like, are organizations ready, Jason, right? Like, are organizations ready to say, okay, you're an officer of the organization, we're going to give you D&O protections, we're going to negotiate, a package for you in case something happens. I'm not sure organizations are ready to build those packages either.
I don't think they are, but I also don't think they will even put a good effort into trying unless there's a motivating factor to make them try.
Yeah, I'll comment and say there are organizations
try to get it right unless they have to.
Yeah, there are organizations that are doing it, but the vast majority, it's not happening, right? And I will say it's probably not happening proactively. Like, if you're a CFO, I would say that that's probably part of the package you should assume when the offer comes, right? If you're a CISO, you're going to have to be asking about that.
Right.
Yeah. So,
and then the question on the table: if it does happen, what is that CISO ultimately responsible for? What is that entire portfolio of their responsibility, their accountability, what they're consulted on, and what they strictly need to be informed about? Where's that RACI chart, and where are all those responsibilities? Because that has to be well defined. Has to be.
Yeah. Where's yours, Jason? Do you have one?
I do. I mean, we can start talking.
I would argue
what are the responsibilities?
That generally
right?
that should be part of the conversation you're having in the hiring, but that should be part of your first 90 days of actually putting that concrete and getting sign off
in your employment agreement.
Yeah,
should be part of your employment agreement.
Yeah. All right. Name off a few. I think it's good for people to get kind of an idea. Let's keep it at a higher level. We don't have to get into super detail, Jason, but like, what are some of those responsibilities?
Yeah. So I mean, they're the obvious ones, and then they're the ones that aren't so obvious, right? Obviously, security operations, security, and we can drive deep into every single one of these, but security operations, security architecture, business resilience. But then let's talk about the business enablement side. There's a whole portion of a CISO role that should be business enablement, mergers and acquisition, data analytics,
due diligence,
business continuity, right? I mean, these are all things that there's a level of responsibility that the CISO has, and there's a level that they need to be consulted on and informed about, right? Mergers and acquisitions are a huge one that CISOs are so underestimated that they can bring value to the table. But it's a huge, huge, huge benefit to have a CISO come in and talk about the technical risk, right? The privacy risk that's coming if you acquire an organization. Then there's there's compliance and audit, obviously. There's legal and HR. Physical security is a huge piece of it. Risk management. Research and development. Research and development. Think about this. You have to protect your intellectual property. They play a huge role in research and development. And then let's talk about executive management side of the aisle. Board report outs, corporate report outs, all of those items there. There's an executive management and business intelligence piece of that role that is extremely important as well. And those are just, again, I'm just rattling them off, right?
Yeah, there's outbound functions too, right? So, if you think about things like, PR, right? Getting out there and being able to talk on behalf of the company, articulate the security position that the company has and why they're doing it in a strong and, customer-friendly way. What are you doing to be privacy enabled, right? How are you enabling that for the company, and what does that mean for consumers or third parties you deal with? There's a sales function if you're doing it well, right? You're not the primary person, but you should certainly on larger opportunities from a third party risk side. One can look at it from a technology company and say, look, we're a tech company, so of course we want to get the salesperson involved. But then another company, hey, we sell barbecue sauce, right? Well, yeah, that doesn't sound like you'd want the CISO involved in the sales cycle, but maybe if you're selling to restaurants and there's been a lot of third-party risk issues where restaurants haven't been getting delivered third-party supplies, right? Then maybe it's really important that you set the stage and you show a competitive advantage in why that company wants to consume your product or services versus another company. And it then accelerates and sets the tone for the company. So, I think, it's inbound and outbound. There's a lot of value to offer. You just have to figure out how it works for your company and how you become part of that value proposition.
Yeah, and we didn't even talk about the third-party vendor side of the aisle, right? The whole vendor risk side of things and partner risk. And there's so much there. Just the supply chain, let's call it the supply chain risk, right? So much on that side as well. So, the level of accountability that a CISO has, let's call it accountability and responsibility, is just massive. From the legal side, compliance side, governance piece, not just the security architecture, security operations. There's a whole human resources portion of it as well. I don't know how many times HR comes out and talks about insider threat and making sure we're making good hires and things like that. So, yeah, the responsibilities are deep and wide, let's say.
And when you think about that, all the points that we touch on, why wouldn't you have that person with the seat at the table? Because they touch every area of your business.
Yeah,
every area.
Let's talk about that piece. Budget responsibilities. Who better than a CISO that has a 30,000-foot view of an organization help to identify technology consolidation, process consolidation, economies of scale, right? The CISO has that 30,000-foot view of the entirety of the organization. There's some financial portions to that could add tremendous amount of value to the budgeting
and just
process.
For all those things to call out areas of risk, right? Like when you're having those discussions, should we do X, should we do Y? Well, look, It might be a tech risk, but we're really good at identifying risky things, right? And how
That's right.
something's going to be misused or mishandled. So it's key to have that person in the room to offer help with those discussions and decisions.
And then economies of scale from an automation side of the aisle. We can see operational inefficiencies and identify those operational inefficiencies and, recommend automation or orchestration to get those economies of scale.
Yeah, I would also add you've got the culture inside the entire organization from a security standpoint. We start to talk about the human aspect and our ability to have an organization drive security and be secure by default, starting at the human and all the work that Matt and Living Security does. Where does that start from? In order to facilitate that top-down approach of security culture, that's a huge mentoring, motivation, leadership, all of those interpersonal skills that are very difficult to come by. Those aren't just something that you just have. Those are well-groomed over experience and decades.
Yeah.
That's usually handled and managed from a strategic role by the CISO, and the tone is set at the CISO level.
The evangelist
culture
on the
is
inside and outside of the organization. 100%.
Yeah, the culture of the company is probably the greatest indicator of the success of the program, right? If you don't have a great security culture, if you're not driving that from the CEO down and the rest of the execs, and someone doesn't own that, which I would argue should be the CISO, then you're not going to have a good security program. It's going to fall apart because people aren't going to believe in it.
Yeah. All the things that get described to me, I think, is bigger than the historical concept of the chief information security officer. Right.
It's morphed over time into something bigger.
Yeah. And I think the challenge with the role might be that it's named a way, but its responsibilities have grown so much that we almost have to think about this. The title for this executive level position is something that's more encompassing than just information security, because it's got risk management, it's got all these other elements in it. And I think that's probably what's causing some of the grief right now with the CISO role.
Agreed. Mm-hmm. Agreed 100%. Yeah, the responsibilities and accountability has grown over time exponentially. And the risks to these executives has grown, again, for the company and for them personally, grown exponentially. The pressures have grown exponentially. So it's time for whatever this role may be to get the title and the influence that it deserves.
Amen, brother. Gentlemen, always a pleasure to debate these hard topics. I'd like to thank everyone for watching and listening. We'll see you next week on Business Security Week.